So here we are again, part 7, would you believe? Right, so trying to get us quickly through the data creation onto the slightly more enjoyable bit of creating the forms and the coding and all of the kind of functionality. Unfortunately, all the data really needs to come at the beginning. So there's a bit more of it to do yet. Luckily, I don't think we need to import anything from the old Excel spreadsheet anymore. We've kind of done all of the big lump of data that needs to come out of that. So what we're going to have a look at right now is the recipe and mixes scheme, which is a grand name for not such a grand thing. If we have a look at the old spreadsheet, there wasn't really much in the way of a defined recipe. There was nowhere where the recipe was written down. It was just when I decided to make a mix, it would kind of get noted down roughly what the percentages were of everything, and then down here I would choose some ingredients from the stock list, which is obviously a weird way of doing it because these aren't really fixed ingredients, they just happen to be the bottles that are there at the time. So what we're going to do this time around, and which is probably the right way of doing it, is that I'm going to separate an actual recipe from an actual mix of that recipe. This is going to prove much better, and will be one of the main things that means moving from the spreadsheet to the database makes life easy and quick. So basically, recipe data will be fixed for a recipe. That might sound obvious, but essentially what I mean is that when we create a recipe, it's going to have the, VG/PG mix in it. It'll have the percentage of nicotine. It'll state exactly which ingredients and how much of those ingredients is in the recipe, but it won't be specifying which bottle of ingredient we're going to be using. So essentially, unless the recipe changes in some way, once it's in there, it's not going to change. Then what will happen is when we want to make an actual mix, we'll say, we go to the recipe and we say, make a mix of that recipe. And that's where it will help us, and we will decide which bottles or ingredients to use. Nothing else is really going to change in the mix. It's literally going to be the point at which we can say the date that we created the mix, how much of it we made, and which bottles of ingredients we used, so that the amounts of those ingredients can be deducted from the stock. So that's essentially two separate parts that we need to produce now, and we're going to deal with the recipe side of that first. So even for the recipe data, we're going to need two tables. Now the way, and I guess most people are going to know this, but the way that databases work is that you have one record in the database that will hold all of the data for whatever you're trying to describe. And that is fine so long as you know exactly how many of those fields are required for that record. So for example, in the case of a recipe, we have the name of the recipe, and we have, let's say, the VG/PG mix of the recipe. None of that's ever going to change, and it's easy to state. So we can say the name is rhodonite, the mix is 70/30, and that is fine. But then when it comes down to the actual ingredients that are in that recipe, varying from recipe to recipe, it could just be one ingredient, highly unlikely, but it could be from 1 to, well, any number in theory, but somewhere in the order of 5 to 10 would be quite normal. We'll only decide that once the recipe's there, we know how many ingredients are going to be in it. So that's why that we have to have two tables. One that describes the main points of that recipe that are what we will call a one-to-one relationship, one piece of data for one recipe, and a second table that's going to have more than one piece of data for one recipe. So the first table is going to include all of the data that's relevant to that recipe other than ingredients. And as I just said, that's one item per recipe. So the actual field names, if you like, are going to come, or at least be derived, from our old Excel spreadsheet. So if we have a look at that, and we've got an example of what is kind of a hash up between a recipe and a mix in the old spreadsheet, we've got the name of the recipe. So that obviously is one item per recipe. It's got one name, so that's going to be in our first table. The date it's mixed is actually part of the mix. It's not part of the recipe, so that won't be included in here. We'll get to that when we deal with the mixes tables. Volume, likewise, that's, you know, mix dependent. The VG and PG ratio is actually part of the mix, and there's really only one item here, although we could separate VG and PG, but we know there's going to be either 1 or 2, so that goes in the first table of the recipe. The same as the target nic. Concentration, we don't know, that's part of the mix. That could change depending on what nicotine's available at the time, and we'll have to set that when we choose you know, what to actually put in when we mix it. So that will be left out entirely from the recipes, but the actual target nicotine percentage is part of the recipe. Obviously all of the percentage of the flavors are part of the recipe, but we don't know. There could be 1, and this spreadsheet allows for up to 10, but we probably want to allow for as many as we want. So that is a one-to-many relationship, which is going to be going in table 2. We'll get to that in a minute. Likewise, we've got down here the bottle names. Well, we don't want that. We don't want to specify a bottle here, but we do want to specify what the ingredient is. So for example, in our new database based system, rather than saying Flavor Art Cookie _14, we don't care what bottle it is. We don't know what bottle it's going to be when we mix it. All we know is that it's Flavor Art Cookie, and that's what we put in there. But again, that's a one-to-many relationship. So those are the sort of items that we're going to be putting in table 1. So it's everything when there is one, or at least a easily defined number of fields required for that one recipe. Then there's table 2, which is basically going to be the ingredients. So we'll have in table 2 some kind of identifier that ties the recipe that's listed in table 1, which we'll call recipes, and the data that's in table 2, which we'll call recipe ingredients. That will then just be a huge list of ingredients that are tied to specific recipes by an ID. So that can be any number of ingredients per recipe, and that essentially is going to be the ingredient data both here, i.e. the names of the ingredients, and the percentages of the ingredients. So what I'm going to do is quickly create a couple of tables in Access and, you know, give them the right field names that are going to be similar to this, and then I will get back to you. Right, so I've created 2 tables inside Access now, one called recipes and one called recipe ingredients. This is the structure of the recipes table. So we have a recipe ID, which is just an automatically created number by Access, which will increment each time we add a new recipe. And that is to simply uniquely identify this recipe amongst all the recipes that we might end up creating. It then has a name of the recipe, and in our example that could be rhodonite, which is obviously text. Then we have for the recipe the nicotine percentage target that we're looking for, i.e. 0.3, 0.6, etc. Nicotine that we want actually in the recipe, and that is obviously a number. And then we have the VG percentage, and a little bit down here we have the PG percentage. But I've also, just in case I ever need it, included another base type percentage. So let's say it was distilled water, we could add in, you know, VG at 70%, water at 10%, and PG at 20% to make our 100%. Seeing as that could be anything, as well as percentage, I've put in a little text field so we can add in what it is. So we can say it's water, for example. And then we just have some recipe notes, just a text field where we can add any notes relevant to that recipe. So we'll have one record in this. If we have a look at it, we don't have any yet. Yes, there's no recipes in here, and we'll get around to adding a recipe. I'm not going to do it here. I'm going to create a form so we can do something slightly interesting and then use the form to enter the new recipe. So that's the data we've got already, and the main thing that's missing from this recipe is any ingredients. And quite obviously that's because they're in the recipe ingredients table, which is quite short. Again, we just have a unique ID identifying this particular recipe ingredient, which is more or less not going to be used for anything, but always good to have one. Then we have the recipe ingredient recipe ID, which is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially what it means is this number here will match, let's go back into design view, this number here. So basically when we look in this table and we look for, let's say, everything with the number 1 in this field, that will mean it's an ingredient for recipe with the recipe ID number 1. So I think you can see how they're associated. Then we're just going to have the recipe ingredient name, let's say Flavor Art Cookie, and then we're going to have the recipe ingredient percentage, 5% of Flavor Art Cookie. And that's it. So we're just going to have a huge list. Again, we can have a look at the empty list so far, but this will be a huge list of various ingredients, various percentages, and then an ID that ties them to the actual recipe they belong to. So that's about it for now. What we're going to do next is create a couple of forms. It's going to be a little bit more interesting and a bit more complicated because we're going to need to embed the ingredients as a subform within the main form, but we'll get to that tomorrow. Watching paint dry would be more interesting.